76 with Mr. Douglas Valentine, who has the patience of a saint because I botched our meeting and thought we were talking today and we were supposed to talk. Not important. He's the author of The CIA as Organized Crime, as well as The Phoenix Program, America's Use of Terror in Vietnam. And towards the end of the Phoenix Program, you spoke a lot about Phoenix coming home and fusion centers. And admittedly, I don't know a lot about that. So I wanted you to come on and we'll talk about your new book towards the end, but just explain how has Phoenix come home and what exactly are fusion centers?
Sure. Okay. Now, this is a really complex subject, okay? And it involves the combination of lots of different systems. And I don't want to make your listeners bug-eyed with a lot of things that aren't of any interest to them. And for 20 years, I've been trying to find a way to talk about this stuff without making everybody fall asleep. But to put it plainly, the Department of Homeland Security was organized in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks on New York City. Okay, and the idea at the time was that somehow that this would, if there was a Department of Homeland Security in place, these sorts of things would never happen again. So the Department of Homeland Security was created to prevent things like 9/11 from happening again. All right. So how do you go about doing that? Well, it wasn't like they didn't know it was going to happen when it happened. It's like January 6th. They knew it was going to happen. People were talking about it. Trump started saying, we're going to do this even before he lost the election. He said, look, if I lose this election, it's because it was stolen from me. So he covered himself on both sides. If he wins, it's on us. If he loses, it's dishonest. And then having a sense that he would probably lose by 10 million votes, he started preparing a case for how he could, to create an insurrection that would, at least mollify his base. But it's like the same sort of thing. It wasn't like there wasn't enough intelligence in the United States prior to 9/11 warning about this stuff. People had warnings, that bin Laden was preparing to do attacks on the United States, to fly planes into buildings. They were having somebody was having a dry run the day of 9/11, where they were actually pretending that planes were attacking a city. They knew this sort of thing could happen. People have been talking about it for 20 or 30 years before it happened. So anyway, the Department of Homeland Security gets created within a month after the event of 9/11. People have organized what's called the Office of Homeland Security, which precedes the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security is so elaborate. If you have an organizational chart, you look at the damn thing, and it take up like a gymnasium wall to show you all the little boxes with people's names and all the various things they do. It's this incredibly complicated organization. But when it's originally created, it's an Office of Homeland Security. It's a lot less complex. And it has an idea. And the basic idea is that they're going to create a new military organization called NORTHCOM, Northern Command. And the United States military, after being kicked out of domestic operations for the last 25 years, and they got kicked out of domestic operations around 1975 after the Church Committee and all that kind of stuff found out they're spying on everybody. Anybody who opposed the war civil rights groups, the military was just going nuts. And they had infiltrated every organization up in Gazoom. And so 75, they weren't allowed to do it. Well, now all of a sudden, with 9/11, the military is back in the game. And they are the backbone of this new organization called the Office of Homeland Security. And the guy who creates the Office of Homeland Security, and when it happens, I was like bug-eyed, because it's a guy who I had interviewed for my book, The Phoenix Program. And I had been a CIA officer in Vietnam. And I had been part of the Phoenix Program, and all of a sudden, and believe me, from the time I started researching the Phoenix Program in 1983-84, it involved me having to understand bureaucratic organizations and how they interact with each other. Now, this is the mind-numbing stuff. Most audiences just want to know, are the Proud Boys working for the military and Homeland Security? The answer is yes, they are. Is Antifa infiltrated by the Department of Homeland Security? Well, I haven't actually seen any reports saying yes, they are. But use your imagination. If the military was infiltrating, what they call oath keepers actively recruit from law enforcement and the military. So, of course, they're penetrated by the military and law enforcement and managed by them. That's no surprise. But, something like Antifa, I don't know. I imagine they are, because the military really wants to know what those people are doing. Mm-hmm. So they probably have provocateurs in there, too. So just to get that out of the way, just so your audience knows, this intelligence network, the Department of Homeland Security, knows everything that's going on in the country. They have agents and informants and into every police department across the country. Well, how did you get there? And how did they organize it? Becomes the thing that you really have to understand if you want to really understand what's going on and how to change it. And it goes back to this guy, Bruce Lawler, who creates the Office of Homeland Security in October of 2001. Okay, when the whole thing emerges like a rabbit from a magician's hat. It's pure magic that this whole thing just like happens. Okay, and then of course within 6 months it's this whole Federal Department of Homeland Security. But they had to get an office, and the office reports right to the White House, right to Bush. And that's a clue to you that the Department of Homeland Security is also a function of the presidency. As it really receives direction from the president, and that direction is political. Mm-hmm. If you have a Democratic president, he's going to turn the dial ever so slightly so that more companies and contractors who have some sort of connection to the Democratic Party gets jobs in this Department of Homeland Security boondock, and the targets become people who are 1.000 point towards the Republicans or something like that, but it's a function of the presidency and political parties in the United States. And that's why people really want to become president and install an administration, because you control all these bureaucracies politically, whether it's the CIA or the FBI or the military. It's the parties want to control these places by making appointments, just like judges, federal judges. Mitch McConnell's things, appointing judges, conservative judges, anti-abortion judges. That's the thing, and you understand that these big bureaucracies are political, and more than that, they're ideological. They have an ideology that permeates the whole organization. All the organizations of the United States that are military, intelligence, security, and law enforcement are all ideologically right, way to the right. I mean, like, more fascist than the Junkers in Nazi Germany in 1930. I've actually talked with military officers who've done studies on this, and the American military is more Nazistic and fascist and right wing than the Germans were. Okay, I mean, you can't get a job in a police department or the military, or or the FBI or the CIA, if you're a communist or you're a leftist or you believe in civil rights, the first thing they tell you when you sign up is that this is not a social service organization. This is a law enforcement organization or a military organization. And if you have some sort of ideas that any of these intelligence or military or security forces are actually going to help you or help the public, you're out of your mind. We're here to serve corporate America.
Yeah.
And to protect the private property of rich people,
the
people who own the country, and the people who are like the Koch brothers or whoever is buying presidencies, and that comes down to a handful of about 1,000 people or something like that. General Motors, you name the corporations. I mean, they're the ones that create the laws and then fund the presidencies and all that stuff. So basically, these organizations have a little bit of political competition where the Republicans and the Democrats both want to control them, but essentially they're ideological organizations, and they're dedicated to preserving capitalism and the prerogatives of the wealthy people in this country. So they're not really diffuse. I mean, they're not out there organizing Antifa demonstrations unless it's a provocation so that the Proud Boys can come sweeping in. All right, so this is the distinction between how the relationship with the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers as opposed to Antifa, the Department of Homeland Security and all these other places. They actually are trying to advance the ideology of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and destroy the ideology of Antifa. And they might deal with both these organizations, but the ideological purpose is opposite. Okay. And this is, so this is another thing you got to understand. But anyway, getting back to the creation, how this thing was created. They call on this guy, Bruce Lawler. And and I remember writing an article about it in October 2001 about how I knew this guy Lawler and what this Office of Homeland Security was about and what it was going to become. And it was obvious to me. And if it was obvious to me, who's a complete outsider, it meant that everybody who was involved with it knew exactly what they were doing. But Lawler had been a CIA officer in Vietnam in 1971, 72, and 73. And he was involved with the Phoenix program and tangential CIA programs that were trying to kill all the communists in South Vietnam. I mean, they were not trying to kill the right wing in South Vietnam.
Yeah. This
is not what our military and CIA, they are waging a war against communism. And anybody who supports communism in the United States, a leftist, an anti-war person, in the 60s, they kept saying the protesters against civil rights that it's communist organized. I mean, if you go back and you Google the protests from the 1960s, the black people are all dressed in suits, and they're not doing anything violent, and they're being attacked by white people who have signs that say civil rights is communist plot. This is what America is, okay? And so if you're for civil rights, if you're against the war, because war is America's business, business is good, and it started becoming that way. I just have to go back a little bit more after World War II. And this is another thing you got to understand. But anyway, getting back to the creation, the World War II. They call on this guy, Bruce Lawler. And what this office of Homeland Security was about, and what this Office of Homeland Security was about, they were not trying to kill the right wing in South Vietnam. I mean, it started becoming that way after World War II. And after World War II, the United States suddenly found itself in control of a lot of countries around the world. It was a military occupation force in Japan, the Philippines, in Germany, in Italy, in Austria. It had all of a sudden the forces that had invaded these countries, a lot of them stayed, and they created military bases, and they started hiring people like Reinhard Gehlen, who had run the intelligence operations against the Soviet Union during World War II. Well, the first thing the Americans do is hire this guy. I mean, he's a Nazi who was running death camps. The SS and the Gestapo worked for this guy. And the first thing the Americans do is hire him and have him activate his intelligence net against Russia. And he hires a staff of 1,000 people, all who are SS officers and Gestapo agents, and these guys all get a pass from the Americans, and they go back to waging war against the communists. And this is the ideology of the American military, of its intelligence forces, and of law enforcement at home. Jim Crow, keeping the blacks down. If they start getting out of step, they're communists. Kill them.
Yeah.
And so this guy Lawler comes out of that envelope. He comes from a little town in Vermont, and he wanted to be I think he was at Georgetown University studying to be an attorney, a lawyer, and gets recruited into the CIA, and they send him to Vietnam. And his job is uncovering communist agents and who are actually nationalists who've been fighting. First they were fighting the Chinese, then they were fighting the French, then they were fighting the Japanese, and then when the World War II was over, the United States reinserted the Vichy French back in control of Vietnam. These were colonialists, and so what they were known at the time was the Viet Minh, and they were a front for a bunch of different nationalist groups, not just communists, but the communists had the biggest appeal to the people who were all peasants, and they, landless peasants, and so they, 99% of the population backed them. Mm-hmm. And this guy named Ed Lansdale, who is a very famous spy that Fletcher Browdy accused of killing Kennedy, created the term Viet Cong in 1956. It sounded like King Kong, Min the Merciless. It just had this ring of it. But the communists in Vietnam never called themselves Viet Cong.
Really?
It was a word that the Americans created in 1956, and they started sprinkling it around after they had kicked the French out, sprinkling it around in newspapers that they controlled, and pretty soon it becomes this term. And, by the time the war starts 10 years later, all these American guys, dumb, 99% of them are just dumb American boys who've been watching John Wayne movies since they could, their eyes opened, think, well, I'm going to go fight the Viet Cong.
Sure.
Which is a made-up organization and, a made-up name that doesn't exist. And they're so deluded about what they're fighting that's what they go there and they do. And this guy, Bruce Lawler, is one of them. Okay. It's just crazy. It's called psychological warfare, and it's creating a name like this, like creating a name like Al Qaeda. You realize that Al Qaeda never called itself Al Qaeda.
Really?
That's a name that the CIA made up and imposed upon them, and stuff like that. These are all scripts that the CIA is writing, and then through Hollywood and newspapers here in the United States and other television and the media outlets that they control. They're creating this reality. They're creating an enemy that's horrible that we can fight. Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is tearing little babies in their incubators from their oxygen and throwing them to a pack of wolves that are waiting outside the window. Not true. Okay, it didn't happen. This is stuff that they're making up, and they do it on grand scale all the time because they control the media. However, they want more and more control all the time. Anyway, so this guy Bruce Waller, who's the epitome, and who, if you can understand him and all these ideological and organizational forces that are converging, you can understand the Department of Homeland Security. He gets mad at the CIA in Vietnam and he quits. He accuses his boss's deputy of having an affair with a Viet Cong agent. The women of Vietnam are beautiful, and 90% of the guys that go to Vietnam go for a year, 6 months, and they have relationships with as many pretty Vietnamese girls as they can, and they go home. Nobody's like actually living there and trying to establish relations with the Vietnamese. They're just exploiting them. War and pornography are the same thing, which is why men wage war and why men control the country and why we've only ever had male presidents and why the Pope's a man and the rabbis are all men and the priests are all men, although the Catholic priests, of course, are not just men, they're also men who are praying and little boys, because why else become a priest if you can't get little boys? Anyway.
It's part of the perk.
So anyway, we're in a patriarchal society, and that's part of it too, but this offends this guy, Bruce Waller, and he rats out his boss's deputy, and he says, I don't understand. How could this be? He's a young, innocent guy at the time, and he doesn't understand that all these CIA guys are just in it for the power and the money and having a good time. And it offends him. So he gets kicked out of the CIA. And he goes back to Vermont and decides he's going to run in the Democratic Party for Attorney General of the state of Vermont. And he's actually becoming kind of a liberal guy. And, he's going to join the Democrats. And anyway, so he starts this campaign for Attorney General of the Democratic Party, in the election. And he's running against three other people who are in the campaign for Attorney General. And a bunch of old hippies up in Vermont found out that he was in the CIA in the Phoenix program. And they start blasting him, And all of a sudden there's people with pitchforks and torches outside his house at night accusing him of being a war criminal. And poor Bruce Waller, I can't believe it. And it's like, where do I go in the world? At first, I wanted to be in the CIA and the military and a champion for America. And it turned out that these guys were all corrupt and self-serving warlords. So I got out of that. And then I tried to be a good guy. And then the liberals came after me. So from that day on, Bruce Waller hates liberals. I mean, that cost him the election up there in Vermont. I really, really hate peaceniks and liberals and hippies, especially women hippies, because they were the ones that were leading the charge against them. And this is a phenomenon that you see all throughout the military and the police, is that they really don't like women at all. Feminism, they treat women like Trump, they're just sex objects, and if you have female qualities, then you're not really a man. And like the drill instructor in that movie, Full Metal Jacket.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of your people that are listening have seen this. It's a Stanley Kubrick movie that satirizes the Marine Corps and the world and the Vietnam War. And the first half of the movie is about all these Marine recruits, and the drill instructor just constantly calls them fags, and all their little marching cadences are about abusing women and treating women as, and this is what the military drives into people. It's recruits. When they break down all their ideas of goodness so that they can become killers, any kind of connection that they have to humanity. Because when you go to war, it's not like you're just killing Japs in bunkers or SS officers. Nowadays you're killing women and children, old people, So you got to really make these guys, a good Marine just wants to kill anybody, just kill. I'm a killing machine, a mean fighting machine. And so you got to dehumanize all these people. And so this Stanley Kubrick movie really drives that home, that militarism and pornography and abuse of women are the same thing. I mean, these things are in this, so this anti-feminism becomes part of the whole law enforcement, military intelligence ideology. And it's at the beginning of it, and now Bruce has adopted that too. Okay, he originally was teetering, and typical of so many of these guys who are, how can I put it, unstable. And so he goes back and he tries to get in the fold. He goes to a guy named William Colby. And Colby had been a guy at a career shooter's program in South Vietnam. And he'd been a career CIA officer and been in the OSS in World War II. Colby was head of the Far East Asia Division from 1961 to 1967. He basically created the Vietnam War. Anyway, so with his tail between his legs, Lawler goes back to Colby and says, "Please forgive me." Colby's a Catholic, and I think Lawler's a Catholic too. I don't know, maybe it helps if you're a Catholic because you can give forgiveness. I'm not really just trying. I'm kind of just, I have a lot of good Catholic friends.
Yeah.
But, it is a phenomenon what goes on. And anyway, so he gets back in the fall. And Colby arranges for him to get back into the military. And Lawler, throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, because he has this CIA connection, steadily rises through the military ranks. And in 1999, Bruce Lawler gets put in charge in the military of the military's, the division, the department within the Department of Defense, and he's now a major general. He's got medals all over his jacket, and little braids and, all this stuff. And becomes a major general, and he runs what's called Civic Affairs branch of the United States military in the United States. And Civic Affairs, the military civic affairs, is the branch of the military that deals with the civilian population. All right, and this is the thing that they've been perfecting since World War II. Since they started occupying countries like Germany, Japan, Austria, all over the world, they had to find a way. The military now ran these countries. Well, how do you deal with the civilian populations in these countries? And they created this whole division of psychological warfare and civic affairs so that they would start learning how to deal with civilians, which up until the World War II is something that the United States military ever did. The only relationship they ever had with civilians was dropping hydrogen bombs on them, or rolling over, destroying French villages on their way towards Berlin. They had no regard for civilians. Get out of the way or I'll kill you. That was it.
Yeah.
And when they wanted the women, they gave them candy bars and nylon stockings, and their village had just been bombed, and they were glad to get that stuff, and so that was the extent of it. So they had to start getting it to be more sophisticated than bombing people and then giving the surviving women chocolate bars and nylon stockings to have sex with them. And they developed these civic affairs and psychological warfare branches, and they keep evolving. That's why they create the Green Berets, the special forces, in 1951, so that they can have this group of guys who dress in civilian clothes, and they go out into foreign countries and they create, like Tom Dooley. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was his famous Catholic missionary in Laos and Vietnam, and he would create little medical centers in these like faraway countries in the remote areas, and he would deliver medicine to the natives. Well, this is what the special forces do. They go out into Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, and all throughout South America, and they create these little medical centers, and they dispense, smallpox shots to people, or they treat their wounds, and while they're doing this, they hire them as informants. and then they send them to schools, and they indoctrinate them to become their agents, and they start spreading agent nets all around the world. And this is the essence of civic affairs and psychological warfare. And it evolves from World War II with all these occupational forces, which the military had never been, really involved with before. When they were spying on Americans in the 60s and 70s, they just spied on them. It wasn't like they were trying to make friends with them and disguise that they were spying on them. But now, all of a sudden, in the 1980s and 90s, they're really trying to find a way where they can, and the propaganda is, meanwhile, the psychological warfare is building against American civilians. And they've gotten over the Vietnam War syndrome. How could America lose a war? Well, the peaceniks. Blame it on Rocky. The Rocky movie comes out in 1985. And we didn't lose the war. It was the peaceniks. Sold us out. And then he shoots 400 people. And this and all of a sudden now everybody in America's got to have an automatic weapon and hate peace sticks. And all these movies are building up through the 80s and 90s. And when 2001 comes along, the 9/11, Bruce Lawler is there in place, and he's head of the military's civic affairs and psychological warfare branch in the United States. And what does he do? He creates the Office of Homeland Security, which establishes the Northern Command, which is the first time the United States military actually has a command in the continental United States, and it becomes the background of this office. And all the law enforcement agencies of the federal government and the state governments and local governments are all built around this. And at the center of it is not just the military, this Northcom, but the CIA, which has inserted Bruce Lawler into the military, because the CIA is much better at all this civic affairs and psychological warfare than the military. The military is always a couple of years behind the CIA with this, kind of propaganda, psychological warfare, scientific, psychological studies and stuff. And the CIA is at the bottom of it. So now they create this Office of Homeland Security based on this military Northcom, which is going to now continue the indoctrination and advance the ideological indoctrination of all the federal, and that's like FBI, law enforcement, throughout the Department of Justice, any federal customs, ICE, the DEA, all the federal law enforcement agencies are now going to be subject to control by this new Department of Homeland Security, which means they're going to be getting this ideological direction from these people, which is, first of all, anti-communist, anti-Muslim, anti-woman, anti-peace, pro-war, and this whole thing, and it now establishes control for all this psychological warfare, and it sets up and brings them all together, along with what's called the critical infrastructure. By 2000, they were ready to integrate the internet into this system of control, of psychological and ideological control. So one of the basic functions of the Department of Homeland Security is to spread the internet throughout all these things, and to start spreading the military propaganda across the internet, and it's going to provide security for this internet, new phenomena, which has just, again, big coincidence, emerged at the same time as 9/11. And there's this whole now total reorganization of American intelligence, security, and military forces. And then the war on Iraq begins 2 years later after a careful buildup. We've already gone into Afghanistan. And this whole Department of Homeland Security, which controls the internet, works with every civic organization in the United States. I mean, from the Knights of Columbus to the Junior Chamber of Commerce to the American Medical Association to the publishers and the newspaper organizations. Any civic organization or labor organization, they all are part of what's now called the critical infrastructure. And this is what the Department of Homeland Security is created to protect: the critical infrastructure, the highways. So the highway department in every village, town, state, and federal agency now becomes absorbed into the Department of Homeland Security. And there's somebody at every one of these, at the transportation department who's an agent of the Department of Homeland Security. There's an agent of the Department of Homeland Security in every hospital, because you got to have people watching out for Muslims who come, are infiltrating, looking for some kind of medical help under the pretext of blowing up the hospital. And Bruce Lawler is in charge of putting this whole thing in place.
Jesus, my head. Yeah, okay.
Which he does. And then, being Bruce, he has arguments with his boss and he gets fired. And now they don't need him anymore. But it was absolutely built on the Phoenix program. The Department of Homeland Security is organized on the Phoenix program in South Vietnam, which brought together in South Vietnam, exactly like the Department of Homeland Security, every police force, local police force, state police force, federal police force, every intelligence agency, and every military department, and aimed them at the communists and the pacifists and anybody who was providing any political party that might present any kind of challenge to the American puppets. And in the United States, the American puppets are known as the Democratic and Republican parties. And they have this binary sort of trans political identity, where they sort of create this little recurring ongoing anvil chorus of hammering out each other. But at the root of both of them, it's the business party.
Yeah.
They both represent businesses.
Yeah.
And all those businesses are part of Homeland Security. They're part of the critical infrastructure. And now they're all joined together to create this huge security apparatus that controls the whole United States. And it's based on the Phoenix program, and which was the Phoenix program in South Vietnam was computerized, started in 1968, where they started keeping computer records of anybody who could be targeted as a communist or a communist sympathizer. Well, the Department of Homeland Security has a gigantic computers, which keep track of everybody. I mean, it's beyond anything that you could believe, but at the center of it is the CIA. And the CIA controls the Department of Homeland Security and the military operations, although they don't really have to tell the military what to do, or the cops or anybody else, because they're so ideologically indoctrinated that, it's just like Marine recruits. I mean, somebody tells them what to do. Yes, sir. They don't really need to exercise a lot because it's so ideologically pure. But At the heart of it is the CIA, and the CIA operates in the Department of Homeland Security clandestinely through its Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which all the rest of the branches, they have informal relationships with the CIA, but the CIA actually works in the Department of Homeland Security through the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and that branch, which was always the core of the even the Office of Homeland Security, it analyzes all the information that's being, in a particular, every Department of Homeland Security sets up a fusion center, which is exactly like what the Phoenix program did. The Phoenix program had intelligence operations coordinating centers in every village, district, and province in South Vietnam, which brought police, intelligence, and military services together. Well, this is what the Department of Homeland Security is. And every state, they have a fusion center, which coordinates all the intelligence and analyzes it from that state about, well, the guy at the local 7-Eleven says that there's a guy that belongs to Antifa, and he comes in here and he gets a six-pack every other night, and boom, his name goes into the computer, and that goes to the computer at the fusion center in the state, and from there it goes to the CIA. And the CIA looks and watches at these people and says, well, did they go overseas? And if they go overseas, then these people become possible recruits for them, which is why they want to have control over the intelligence and the analysis, because everything through this one office filters up to the CIA, and then they can use it for hiring Muslims to send to Syria or Somalia or anybody to send anywhere. It becomes a way for them to recruit agents. All right? And this, because we live in a global village now, and we have to be able to reach into every part of the world. And the Department of Homeland Security provides this endless stream of potential recruits for the CIA through its Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which after January 6th, and it keeps evolving and getting more perfect all the time. Besides being, totally dedicated to psychological operations to affect the beliefs of civilian Americans and to make them hate communism and leftism and civil rights and all the traditional American military, police, and intelligence values. They want to control them. They want to control the political and social movements in the United States, and this is and the Republicans and the Democrats are happy because the stasis, 49% of this, 201 to 212 creates this gridlock, which ensures that nothing ever changes and the rich just never pay less and less taxes all the time, which is, if you just look at the statistics, you see it's true. Yeah. Okay, so this has been a very highly effective operation. But after January 6th, they've created a new office within Department of Homeland Security, Intelligence and Analysis. They have now created Domestic Terrorism Unit. Okay. And this is like what the whole thing had been evolving towards from the beginning. Now the CIA can reach in and manipulate the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers and Antifa and anybody else it wants, because that Domestic Terrorism Unit and the Office of Intelligence Analysis is basically, whether it says it on the organizational chart or not, you're not allowed to put CIA on an organizational chart. It's a clandestine covert operation. It recruits guys in the military and the Department of Justice and the Treasury Department, and they become clandestine agents of the CIA. It recruits people in every business in the United States. I mean, this is how they operate overseas. They create guys working for Ford Motor Company, and then they send them over to start a franchise in
China,
Okinawa.
Yeah.
And now they've got an agent, CIA agents, running a Ford Corporation in Okinawa. I mean, you do this all over the world. And the Department of Homeland Security and the military are all glad to go. They're all glad to go along with this because it just perpetuates and solidifies the control of this ideology here in the United States. And now under Biden, it's reaching even greater effectiveness and organizational purity, and it's just going to keep going on and on and on and on while the Trumpites and I don't know, whoever they hate, the black people or liberals, keep banging each other on the head, and in the meantime, this guy, I can't remember who his name is, going to go to the moon. Some rich billionaire is gonna take a plane to the moon, because this is what he always wanted to do, since he was a little boy. And this is a situation that we live in the Department of Homeland Security, as established by Bruce Lawler and a couple of other people who were all basically manipulating poor Bruce, who was just like programmed to do what he would, from the they had psychological profile this guy, and they knew they could point him in a certain direction, because he was seeking redemption with the military establishment and the CIA. They would do whatever they wanted. They just control them and set them forward like those Marines in Full Metal Jacket. Their boss tells the sergeant says, go, kill all those people, and they go do it. And this is what we find the situation that we find ourselves in now. And a person like me, who explains this very simply to you, is what's known as elitist. Because I'm not part of one of these ideological factions. I'm just trying to look at it for what it is and what it's happening. So that's the role and the function and how it evolves: civic affairs, psychological warfare, directed against Americans in order to create a society that allows the establishment of an organization, the Department of Homeland Security, that it covers every inch of the United States in every possible way, shape, form, with the ultimate purpose of giving the CIA more clout overseas because of its potential to recruit in this global village that we live in, people that it can send overseas to do its building and advance and start turning the whole world into one big, junior chamber of commerce.
You broke my brain.
Well, I thought we've discussed all this before, haven't we?
Not that it's so simple. Label it critical infrastructure, and then you absorb it into the marriage of the state and the corporation, and it's total control.
Oh yeah, sure. And just one last thing.
Sure. No. I love it.
Started after World War II. They had to organize the army in order to conduct civic operations, psychological operations. They had to actually organize it. So who did they choose? The head of the president of General Motors, a guy named called Engine Charlie Wilson, and Robert McNamara, who had run Ford Corporation. Yep. I mean, these are salesmen for corporations. And from the end of World War II right up to now, it's been people from the private sector, the heads of big corporations, who have been chosen to organize and control the Department of Defense. Now, if you think that that's an aberration, or that somehow it isn't, connected, that everywhere the generals go, they have contracts in their hip pocket, and when they graduate from the military as a major general, they go and they sit on the board of a corporation or a multinational. If you think that's an exception to what's going on, I mean, really join the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers. The whole thing is set up to advance the interests of the very wealthy corporate elite, and they basically have organized and controlled the military since World War II to that end, and they just get more and more sophisticated. And they made, a Mao Zedongish great leap forward in 2001. When, out of nowhere, the Twin Towers got bombed by somebody who we never knew they were coming, and just like January 6th, how do these things happen? Intelligence failures, it's like, how many times does somebody have to, fake you out before you start thinking about things differently? But, people are people, and they like going to church on Sunday and having barbecues, and that's what they really want to do. And when it comes to actually trying to change themselves or the way they think about things to make a more equitable society, that's really like way down on the list. And compared to going to the shooting range, and firing off a couple of rounds and feeling like a man.
Yeah.
That's an important thing to do and learn how to do. So we live in a kind of brainwashed society with very little chance of ever, stopping, let alone reversing this process until the climate is utterly destroyed. And like, who's the guy that's going to the moon on his
Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, until all the rich people go to the moon, when they start a new perfect society with little Lolitas fed to them by Jeffrey Epstein, and the Clintons can become kings again, and all that kind of stuff, but that's where it's all heading, and in the meantime, it's just la la la.
But it almost seems inevitable. It seems that this is what was always going to happen.
Inevitable. There's no way that it's ever going back. This is what we live in. It's like old age. You get old, you die, and at the end, it's not very happy.
Yeah.
Well, our society and our world have become a metaphor for the individual consciousness. There's a point where you have God consciousness, where your ego, like with Bruce Lawler, vanishes. You take some acid and you realize, it's all one. And then you come down from the acid like Bruce Lawler, and you find yourself without a job. And, actually creating a peaceful, kind world becomes secondary when you have all sorts of resentments. And when you've lost the Vietnam War, and when Black people are starting to make advances, all these things become sources of the kind of sources of resentment and shame that a demagogue like Trump can just roll up into a ball and create 70 million followers from in a day.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember back before he started running, I can't remember, it was a newspaper guy he turned to and he said, "This is crazy." All of a sudden I'm a leader with 70 million people. He didn't even, he was just as astounded as anybody else. But all those, he had people like Stephen Miller working for him and Fox News who knew how to play, again, psychological civic operations on the resentments and shame and loss that white people were feeling. And even though they haven't lost anything, and even though they have no reason to feel shame, those feelings are created within them, and then they're used, And if people just really took a step back and realized that's not the way to go, then things would change. But people are too stupid, and that ain't going to happen.
Now is there? And I know you said we got to wrap this one up, but we've talked about this. We've talked about this before.
Of course, I can't talk anymore.
Oh no, you're good. Yeah. No, we'll wrap it up. We've talked about this before, though, with psychedelics and love. If everything is one, and we are all one, and we're one God consciousness, then does any of this even matter? Is this just an 1 second in the dream of God that it becomes the Department of Homeland Security and critical infrastructure? Is this all? It's of no worry because it will die.
There's a new concept that, if you want to talk about the aesthetic part of it at some point.
Sure.
God's shame is God is evolving like Bruce Lawler.
Okay.
And God is a projection of human consciousness. He's not a real thing. Consciousness is consciousness. But there's been so much anti-consciousness that consciousness has now become ashamed of itself. And I call it God's shame.
Okay.
And this is the new phase that humanity has entered into. And very sad to see. But the whole idea of God's just a projection of what's going on inside humanity, humans. And anyway, snakes don't have to think about it.
Yeah, it's
chipmunks aren't really interested in this stuff. They want to gather some nuts. And they're perfect, innocent beings. And at some point, humans with their consciousness got off track, and it went from being God's love to being God's shame. But I can talk to you about that at some point, and how everything that's going on in the world right now is sort of a reflection of that.
I think that would be a wonderful episode we could do. Real quick, if you want, could you tell everyone about the book you're working on, or are you keeping that close to the chest?
Yeah, it's a book called. I haven't got a publisher yet. It's like, how did it go to our publishers? You got to get that on your hands and knees. And, some 30-year-old kid that kisses ass. And then the publishers say, well, who are you? And what have you ever done? And oh God, and then you got to sign contracts. It's just awful. But writing the books is fun. It's called Pisces Moon.
Okay.
Beliefs and Brutal Truths About America. And it is a lot about my personal evolution and all this, set against, events since World War II.
I think that will be fantastic because you are a fantastically interesting person. I love talking to you, Mr. Valentine. You're wildly intelligent. You're one of the few people that I can just sit here and listen to. It's you really are a treasure, and I am infinitely.
Come over and do some garden.
I know I owe you some garden work because I bailed on our podcast yesterday, so I gotta go. Yeah, I gotta go. Shovel some shit and rake your lawn. I'll send you an email. I would love to do another podcast on what you talked about, the reflection of the projection of God as human consciousness moving from innocence and love to God's shame. I think that would be a fantastic podcast.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
I'll link to this one too. Okay?
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. Valentine. Your books, The Phoenix Program, as well as the CIA's Organized Crime, both on Audible. Both books I highly, highly recommend. I'll put them in the description as always. They are fantastic listens. The Phoenix Program is one of the most terrifying books I've ever listened to. I won't spoil it, but the shit we did in Vietnam will make your blood turn to ice. It's insane. Mr. Valentine, thank you so much, sir. God bless everybody. Stay safe.
Okay,
and I'll email you. All right. Goodbye. You have a good one.
Recording stopped.